Again, I just want to thank everyone for being here, and I want to thank Scott for coming to speak. He's got an amazingly busy schedule, so we're so lucky to have you here. Thank you. And I just want to, wait, did I introduce myself? My name's Daniel Shaw. I'm the board chair of ACES. My gosh, forgot that part. And actually, I was just picked out of a bubble lottery as a person in the crowd to come talk, so randomly. So sorry about that. And anyway, I just want to spend just 2 seconds. This speaker series and dialogue series was started by my late father-in-law, Henry Catto, in memory of my late mother-in-law, Jessica Catto, who was a profound conservationist and visionary. And so I just want to say hi to my wife, Isa Catto, and my brother-in-law, John Catto, and his family who are here tonight. And to thank Henry for getting this started, and also thank ACES and for giving us a home to do this and to bring amazing people into our community to have these conversations that are badly needed and will be needed in perpetuity. And I especially want to thank Chris Lane, the executive director of ACES, who took over this job 11 years ago and had huge shoes to fill taking over for Tom Cardamone. Tom, can you say hi? Who really brought ACES into its current incarnation and made it what it is today, which is an incredible organization and a really wonderful part of this valley and of this community. And in fact, anyone who works for ACES, could you please stand up and who's in the crowd here and say hi? Back there, anyone? So, thank you all. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Chris Lane, who, like I said, started this 11 years ago. He was a much younger and better looking when he started, but I guess this will do that to you.
Thank you for that introduction. You know, coincidentally, not because of tonight, my wife, about a week ago, asked me, she said, if you could redo your life and you could do a different career, and it has to be different, it can't be the same career, what would you do? And I thought about it long and hard, and I concluded an ornithologist. I thought, I want to be an ornithologist. I want to travel the world studying birds, and here I am tonight. And what makes that so special is when you're someone who is an avid birder like myself, and you get a chance to introduce someone like Scott Weidensaul. That's like, say, an avid sports fan getting to introduce Tom Brady. So we're going to take a look at that, and here's what it looks like. Tom Brady played 23 seasons. He went to 10 Super Bowls. He runs a 5.2 40-yard dash. Scott Weidensaul, he's been an ornithologist for 25 years. He's written 30 books, was a Pulitzer Prize finalist, and runs a 40-yard dash in, okay, my money's on Tom Brady for that one. Tom Brady started his career in 1995 at the University of Michigan, was drafted by New England Patriots. Then he moved to the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. Now he's a sports commentator. Scott began writing in 1978. His writings appeared in publications including Smithsonian, the New York Times, the Nature Conservancy, National Wildlife, and Audubon. For 25 years, he's directed a major effort to study movements of northern saw-whet owls, one of the most underrepresented and amazing raptors and least understood raptors in the world. He lectures widely on conservation and nature, directs ornithology programs for National Audubon's famed Hog Island in Maine. Anybody been there? Yes, we've got some people, Scott, that have been there. Okay, Tom Brady. He lost $48 million in a cryptocurrency exchange. Scott, on the other hand, his newest book, A World on the Wing, The Global Odyssey of Migratory Birds, is a New York Times bestseller. Yeah. Scott's a fellow at the American Ornithological Society. He's married. He and his wife live in northern Appalachian Mountains of New Hampshire. Tom Brady, meanwhile, is divorced. Still, Tom and Scott have a lot in common. Tom Brady, as I think many of you know, is known as one of the greatest of all time. And tonight, we have someone, Scott Weidensaul, who's also known as one of the greatest of all time. Now, while Tom Brady's career is over, Scott is in his prime. So, welcome, Scott Weidensaul. Get up here.
Woo. Wow. Best intro ever. Oh, man. And we live in New Hampshire now, which is Patriots country, and I'm not a football fan. And so I guarantee you I will never be compared to Tom Brady again. So I just want to say thank you, first, not just to Chris for the introduction, but for all of you for coming out on a gorgeous, what are you thinking coming inside on a night like tonight? It's an honor to be here. It's an honor to be part of this distinguished lecture series. And I think there's one more slide I'm supposed to show you there. Yes, right there, explaining for those of you who are not familiar with this lecture series, what it's all about. And I'd like to talk tonight about birds. Any bird watchers here? Okay, good. Oh, thank goodness, I'm with my people. So, even though we live in New Hampshire, I grew up in eastern Pennsylvania, very close to a place called Hawk Mountain. We got Keystoners here, Keystone Staters. Very close to a place called Hawk Mountain Sanctuary, the world's first sanctuary for birds of prey. And I was a museum-quality nature nerd as a kid. And when I was 12 years old, in the autumn of my 12th year, my sisters and I were making a serious attempt to try to kill each other. And so my parents, in desperation, said, oh my God, let's get them out of the house. Let's take them to this Hawk Mountain place that Scott's always talking about. And for those of you who've not been there, it's high on the Kittatinny Ridge at almost 1,800 feet of elevation in the Appalachians of Pennsylvania, in the Ridge and Valley country. And it's this migratory pathway along which every fall 15 or 20,000 hawks, eagles, and falcons migrate. And we just happened by dumb luck to have picked the best migration day of the year. A cold front had come through the night before. The wind was blowing from the northwest. There were hawks all over the sky. I raced up the mountain. I had my cheap pair of binoculars. I had my golden field guide to the birds, which I had been studying, all the little tiny pictures, none of which looked remotely like the birds in the air. But look, you're 12, and so that doesn't matter. And so I'm sitting up there on the rocks on North Lookout with all these other people with their binoculars watching these birds go by, and I'm yelling out identifications. There's a sharp-shinned hawk. That's a Cooper's hawk. Oh, there's a peregrine falcon. And there was this woman sitting on the rocks in front of us who kept kind of turning and looking at me. And then she'd sigh and she'd go back to hawk watching, and then I'd make another terrible misidentification. She'd kind of wince. She finally I made some really egregious mistake, and she put down her binoculars and she said, son, sit down, you don't know what you're talking about. And then she sat down next to me and she said, okay, now watch this next bird coming in. It's about the size of a blue jay, and doesn't have much of a head, and it's flapping and gliding and flapping and gliding. It's a sharp-shinned hawk. It's one of the accipiters. Her name was Jean Litzenberger, and she became one of my hawk watching mentors. My life changed that day in 3 important ways. I became aware for the first time, even though I had grown up among them, of the Appalachian Mountains as this 2,000-mile-long system along which this river of raptors was migrating every year. So I got hooked on the Appalachian Mountains, and I got hooked on raptors because, let's face it, raptors are the coolest birds of all. But mostly that day, I got hooked on migration. And migration in the 52 years since then has been the defining passion of both my personal and professional lives. Back in the mid-90s, I spent about 6 years traveling up and down the Western Hemisphere working on a book called Living on the Wind about bird migration in the Americas. And I wrote this book very much as an outsider looking in. I was only involved in migration research to the extent that I was trapping and banding migrant raptors along the Kittatinny Ridge. In fact, at the time I was running Hawk Mountain's bird banding program, and so catching birds like peregrine falcons and golden eagles and red-tailed hawks and banding them, and sometimes putting radio transmitters on them to follow them. But in the 25 plus years since this book came out in 1999, I've gotten more and more deeply involved in the science of migration, in migration research. And we've also learned in that 25 years so much more about the science of migration, how birds are able to migrate, the distances they're able to go, the physiological changes in their body. And also we've come to understand the dangers and challenges and threats that we're presenting to bird migration all around the world. So about 6, 7 years ago now, I set out again at a global scale this time to trace the routes of bird migration around the world, to talk to the scientists that are doing that research, to reflect actually some of the research that my colleagues and I are doing, because I'm now down in the trenches doing migration research myself, for this book that Chris very kindly mentioned, Living a World on the Wing. And this comes at a time, and I don't think this is going to be a surprise to many of you, that migratory birds are in crisis. Many of you probably read about this blockbuster paper that was published in 2019 by some of the top ornithologists in the country, showing that we've lost a third of North America's birds in the last 50 years. 2.9 billion fewer birds today, individual birds, than there were in 1970 when I was that wide-eyed kid up on North Lookout. And I don't want to take a beautiful evening like this and start out with a buzzkill, but I think it's important for us to understand what we're up against, the challenges that we're facing. And this is particularly true for certain groups of birds. And I swear, this is the only graph I'm going to show you tonight, because graphs are kind of boring. But if you look at these are different habitat associations, different guilds of birds based on habitat. And if you look at the group of birds that is in the worst shape, well, not surprisingly, those are grassland birds, because we have so little natural functioning grassland left in North America. So for birds like bobolinks and western meadowlarks and grasshopper sparrows and upland sandpipers, their numbers have cratered over the last 50 years. But if you look at the other end of that graph, if you look at the top of that chart, you'll see, I think, a roadmap for recovery and a reason for hope. Look what's happened to wetland birds over the last 50 years. Waterfowl like ducks and geese and swans, wading birds like herons and egrets and ibis, their numbers have rebounded dramatically in the last 50 years. And the reason for this is not a mystery either. Starting in the 1980s, when a combination of habitat loss and drought drove waterfowl populations into the toilet, we as a society decided that was not going to stand. And we invested a huge amount of time and money and regulatory muscle and resources into restoring and enhancing wetland habitats. And it's not just dead baseball players. If you build it, they will come. If you create the habitat and restore the habitat, birds only need a fighting chance. They're amazingly resilient. And waterfowl populations have surged to levels that we probably have not seen in North America since the mid to late 1800s. We can do the same thing for grassland birds like these greater prairie chickens. This is primarily a habitat issue. There are other issues, pesticide overuse, a whole host of other things, but at its core, if we put the same effort and time and money and regulation and incentive into preserving and restoring grassland habitats, we can bring back birds like prairie chickens and all the other species that depend on those grassland habitats. It's important for us to remember that it's never too late. Change can come even at the last moment and make an incredible difference. For example, in the course of working on this new book, one of the places I wanted to travel to was the Yellow Sea between China and the Korean Peninsula, which is one of the most important migratory stopover sites in the world for tens to hundreds of millions of migrating birds, including 11 to 13 million migratory shorebirds. And they're coming to the Yellow Sea because it's the linchpin in what's known as the East Asian Australasian Flyways, this really enormous area of the world stretching from New Zealand and Australia through the islands of Indonesia and the Southeast Asia. And the birds funnel up through the Yellow Sea and then spread out on their breeding grounds from Western Eurasia on this end all the way to Alaska and the Yukon on the other end. And during their migration, these birds that have just flown, in some cases, 6,000 miles nonstop from New Zealand or Australia, they land in the Yellow Sea and they're drawn by the largest mudflats in the world. This is a picture of a place called Chaoxini, which is on the Chinese coast north of Shanghai. And when the tide goes out at Chaoxini, it goes out like 20 kilometers, enormous mudflats. And even though the mud looks lifeless on the surface, underneath it's a buffet of annelid worms and small mollusks and other macroinvertebrates that birds that have just arrived on the ragged edge of starvation and must double their weight in less than 2 weeks, and then fly a further 3 or 4 or 5,000 miles to their breeding grounds, it's the perfect place for them. Or at least it used to be. Because unfortunately, China and South Korea in particular, between them, have destroyed about 60 or 70% of the mudflats on the Yellow Sea. They build enormous seawalls that block the ocean from these once rich tidal flats. They fill those tidal flats in with hundreds of millions of cubic meters of sediment to create dry land for industrial sites or cities, or deep water aquaculture ponds like these where they raise fish or jellyfish or shrimp that are too deep for the shorebirds to use. I figured this was going to be, I might as well get this out of the way because this was going to be the most depressing chapter of my book. If you've heard, and I should say that when I traveled over there in the spring of 2018, and the scientists that I was talking to, people like Jing Li, who founded one of the small domestic Chinese conservation organizations, or Tunis Piersma from the Netherlands, they said basically we're down to a birds per hectare equation. For every additional acre of mudflat we lose birds because there is no place else for them to go. A couple of years ago, South Korea built a 21-mile-long seawall that blocked the ocean from 150 square miles of formerly rich tidal flat on which a quarter of the world's great knots depended, and a quarter of the world's great knots disappeared because they had no other place to go. And if you're talking about a critically endangered bird, this becomes a real problem, and that's what that bird is. That's a spoon-billed sandpiper, the weirdest and most weirdly charismatic shorebird in the world. They're about that long, and they have this weirdly spatulate bill. There's only a couple hundred of them left. They breed in the Russian Far East, they winter in Southeast Asia, and twice a year they depend completely and utterly on the mudflats of the Yellow Sea. So they have become the poster child for Yellow Sea conservation, for groups like Jing Li's small nonprofit, Spoon-Billed Sandpiper in China, for large nonprofits and advocacy organizations like BirdLife International, the Paulson Institute, founded by former Treasury Secretary Hank Paulson. They've been lobbying the Chinese government for years to save what's left of the Chinese side of the Yellow Sea, not just for these birds, but for the millions and millions of Chinese citizens that depend on the shellfish and finfish that also depend on those tidal flats. And the amazing thing is, it worked. Just before my visit in 2018 to write what I thought was going to be a depressing book, or a depressing chapter of my book, to spend time with people like Tunis Piersma, who felt his job as a scientist was to document the extinction of these birds, the Chinese government announced a sweeping ban on all further coastal destruction along the Chinese side of the Yellow Sea. And they followed that up by nominating about 24 of the most important Chinese shorebird sites for UNESCO World Heritage protection through the UN. And over the last 2 years, South Korea has somewhat belatedly followed suit, nominating 4 or 5 of their most important sites also for UN protection. So I found myself with people like Xing, who were grappling with this very unfamiliar emotion of hope. But hope can come from the most unexpected quarters, even from parts of the world that we would consider impossibly remote and incredibly poor. For example, these are the mountains of Nagaland in northeastern India. That little bit of India, sticks up like a thumb between Myanmar, Burma to the south, and China to the north. And the mountains of Nagaland, we did not realize this until fairly recently, are astoundingly important for millions and millions of migratory raptors. These are Amur falcons. They're about the size of our American kestrel. They're insectivorous. They feed mostly on insects. And they breed in Siberia, northern China, Mongolia. They winter in southern Africa. They have the longest migration route of any raptor on Earth, about 18,000 miles a year, including a 2,400-mile long crossing of the Indian Ocean. And before they can make that trip, they have to fill up their gas tank. And because they're insectivorous, at the end of the monsoon rain season in late October and early November, they gather in the mountains of Nagaland in these densely forested hillsides because at that time of the year, termites emerge from underground, trillions and trillions of big, fat, plump, juicy, winged adult termites on their mating flights. Makes you hungry, doesn't it? If you're an Amur falcon, that's a hog and slop. And so they gorge on these things, and then they make this incredible migration. And as I said, it is an incredible migration across the Indian Ocean, down to southern Africa, where they spend the winter in southern Africa, feeding on emerging termites. They've really got this whole termite thing dialed in. Every year, millions of Amur falcons gather in Nagaland, and we in the outside world knew nothing about it until 2012, when some Naga conservationists went into this remote area of central Nagaland near the village of Pangti, where they'd been hearing rumors of enormous numbers of falcons, and discovered a slaughterhouse. They discovered that the local villagers were killing about 150,000 of these falcons every year by stretching their fishing nets in the trees where these birds roosted at night. Now this was, I want to stress, this was not a traditional subsistence hunt. They'd only started catching these falcons like this about 10 years earlier, when the Indian government built a gigantic hydroelectric dam that flooded their farm fields. So by catching and killing these falcons and plucking them and smoking them, they were able to sell them in larger communities and cities for cash money to pay for their children's education fees, to send their kids to boarding school, which is understandable. But even for an abundant bird like Amur falcons, 150,000 birds out of that population every year would very rapidly cause collapse. But that didn't happen. Instead, what happened was, well, for one thing, this was technically an illegal hunt, and the authorities have been turning a blind eye to it for a long time. So everybody was put on notice when international attention was drawn to it that that was no longer going to be the case. But mostly because conservationists like Bono Haralu, the woman who first brought this to wider attention, and others sat down with community leaders in Nagaland and said, look, if you keep doing this, these birds are going to disappear. And they said, we didn't know. We'll stop. And they did, completely, from one year to the next. 150,000 dead falcons one year, virtually none the next year. And within 2 years, the world went from condemning them for their barbarity to praising them for their conservation leadership. In fact, many of the former falcon trappers banded together to form what they call the Amur Falcon Roost Area Union to guard and protect the roosts they were once plundering. But one of the reasons that the Naga gave up so quickly on falcon trapping is because they were told this is one of the most amazing wildlife spectacles on Earth, and people are going to want to come to see this, which is true, but it is not easy to get to Pangti. This is, I'm not kidding you, this is the main road to Pangti. That's also an active landslide zone. Every so often, the mountain just lets loose and takes anybody on the road with it, and then they just bulldoze another road across it and use it until the next time the mountain decides to kill some people. I have spent a career traveling on bad roads in remote places. I've never been as scared as I was there. We were also told, do not be on the road after dark because of the danger of armed bandits and cross-border Maoist guerrillas coming in from Myanmar. And did I mention that the Naga, until the middle or late 20th century, many of them were also headhunters? I don't think I mentioned that. They're also 95% Baptist, so Baptist headhunters. It's an amazing part of the world. But it's worth the trip, because I have never, in a lifetime of chasing some of the biggest raptor concentrations on the planet, I've never seen anything like I saw in Nagaland, where we would have, you'd walk in before daybreak, before you could even see anything, you could hear this rushing of wind overhead, and the light comes up, and you realize, no, this is the sound of 50 or 60 or 100,000 falcons swirling up in this great reverse tornado, into the air, and this goes on like this for hours. And this is just one roost. There are roosts up and down the Doyang River Valley. So you look up and down the valley and you just see these huge columns of birds spreading out, gorging on termites all day, coming back. They're there for weeks at a time. There's no other place that I'm aware of on the planet that has this kind of concentration of birds of prey in one place. Just an extraordinary, extraordinary thing. And as you can imagine, the pandemic has made it difficult to bring tourists in there. The folks that I was traveling with, my good friend Kevin Laughlin runs a nature tour company. We've been able to take some groups in there to help bolster that conservation effort. But it's been tough. There's no question about it. The pandemic has made it hard. But it's those kinds of stories about what everybody can do, what anybody can do on behalf of migratory birds, whether you're talking about a totalitarian government or villagers in a remote part of India. It gives me hope. One of the reasons that I'm cautiously optimistic about the future of migratory birds is that we have so much more information today than we had even just 10 years ago. And part of that is because we have the ability to crunch enormous data sets, big data sets now. And one of the most important, believe it or not, was built by the National Weather Service. guarantee that the National Weather Service in the 1980s did not build the Doppler weather radar system for the benefit of ornithology, but it is arguably the single most important tool that we have for studying bird migration. Most birds migrate after dark, even birds that are normally active in the daytime. And you can go outside with a pair of binoculars and stare at the full moon and watch birds fly across it, but you're not going to learn much that way. On the other hand, Doppler radar can tell us with precision exactly how many birds per cubic meter of airspace are flying over the 140-some Doppler weather sites in the lower 48. And we have so much computing power now that we can crunch that data in real time through something called Birdcast, which is a partnership between the Cornell Lab of Ornithology, Colorado State University, and the University of Massachusetts Amherst. So you can go to birdcast.info during the spring and fall migration. You can see a map. So basically what you're seeing here is that red line is sunset, and you can see this explosion of birds moving into the night sky, and there's a ticker down here that will tell you exactly how many birds are up there. There were almost 750 million birds in flight that night in the spring of 2021. That's not unusual during the peak of spring migration. And because we have we've got archived weather radar data that goes back decades, we actually have a time machine so we can see exactly how migration has changed. So radar can tell us how many birds are up there, but it can't tell us what kind they are. For that, you need another kind of big data, and that's eBird. How many eBirders do we have here? How many of you have no idea what I'm talking about? That's okay. So eBird is the largest wildlife observational database on the planet. It's run by the Cornell Lab of Ornithology in New York, and yesterday morning, I was birding at Black Canyon of the Gunnison National Park down near Montrose, and I was running eBird on my phone, and as I saw and heard birds, I kept adding to my checklist what species I was seeing and how many individuals of each one. It kept track of the distance I walked, the time I was out there, how many people were in my party, just me. At the end of the trip, I hit a button and the checklist went to Cornell. Every year, about 100 million sightings like that are deposited in eBird, and what it gives us is this astoundingly detailed picture of what species of birds are where and in what number, not just in North America, but increasingly around the world. And so in the case of yellow warblers, one of the most common birds, they breed here right outside of Aspen. I heard some out at ACES when we were out there earlier today at the Howland Preserve. You can see how these birds are spreading across North America from their breeding grounds in the north down to their wintering grounds in Central America. And the darker the color, the more individual yellow warblers there are there. This gives us a roadmap if we're dealing with birds that are in conservation trouble, where we need to be putting our scarce conservation dollars. Another boots on the ground example, in the Central Valley of California, where agricultural land is incredibly expensive, that's also one of the most important linchpins in the Pacific Flyway. And a couple of years ago, scientists with the Nature Conservancy realized, hey, we can take eBird data that will tell us exactly what species of shorebirds are coming through in what number and at exactly what time of the year, and we can pay rice farmers relatively small amounts of money to flood their rice fields with just enough water at just the right time for just long enough and create tens of thousands of acres of habitat for almost no money. And then as soon as the birds migrate north or migrate south, the habitat can go away. And if it's a year like this where there's lots of water in the Central Valley, they don't have to pay the farmers anything because the habitat is already there. So we have these ways of taking all of this data and making it actionable for conservation. We're also benefiting from an explosion in new tracking technology. And this is the part of migration research that I've been most involved in over the last 25 years, some of this cutting edge technology. For example, 10 years ago, a number of colleagues of mine and I started something called Project Snowstorm to study the winter movement ecology of snowy owls. And so we catch snowy owls, we put these GPS, GSM transmitters on in a little backpack harness. These transmitters are operating off two technologies most of you have in your pocket right now. They're communicating all the time with the GPS satellite system overhead, and so they're recording latitude, longitude, altitude, and flight speed as frequently as every 6 seconds. And then a couple of times a week, they dial up through a cell phone modem in the gizmo and send us all that data cellularly. My friends are cooler than your friends because I get text messages from snowy owls. And at this point, we've tagged 115 snowy owls in 17 states and provinces. This project is funded entirely by small crowd-funded donations from the general public, and all the mapping data that we produce with this is available on our website. So if you just go to projectsnowstorm.org, you can see where our owls have been, where they're going. The one thing we won't tell you is where the owl is right this minute, because we don't want you to chase the owl and harass it. So we time delay everything by about 24 hours. These transmitters weigh about 45 grams, which on a 6-pound snowy owl, I'm not even sure they necessarily notice it. If you put a 45-gram transmitter on a 30-gram Swainson's thrush, on the other hand, you will get no migration data at all. And until recently, it was almost impossible to track most migratory birds, because most migratory birds are small, across landscape distances. But that's changing now thanks to something called the MODIS Wildlife Tracking System. This was the brainchild of Birds Canada, kind of the Canadian equivalent of the Audubon Society, and it uses two technologies that have been around for a long time. Highly miniaturized VHF radio transmitters, some of them a fraction of a gram, I mean literally small enough to put on migratory butterflies or migratory dragonflies. And then tracking them with these automated receiver stations that kind of look like somebody forgot to take down their old-fashioned television antenna. There are now about 1,600 of these MODIS receiver stations around the world. This started in eastern Canada, and it's kind of grown from there. I'm involved with a group in the Northeast. We've put about 160 of these stations in the Mid-Atlantic and New England. It is exploding across the West. There is a rapid increase in MODIS stations in places like Colorado. At the moment, most of the MODIS stations are in the Front Range or east, but the folks down at Black Canyon Audubon, they're going to be putting up MODIS towers, MODIS receiver stations down in that area. All of the data from all of these 36,000 birds and bats and insects that have been tagged with these things is, again, publicly available. If you go to the MODIS website, motus.org, and click on I'll just go back for a second, any of those little yellow dots on the map, those are all receiver stations. You can find the one closest to your home, click on it, it'll be a list of all the individuals that they've tagged. You can actually map them. Like, for example, one of my former owl banding volunteers is doing her PhD on nighthawks and whippoorwills. You can see where Alora's nighthawks have been going on their migration to South America. It is really, really cool. We've also been learning so much more, not just about where birds are going, but how they get there and the physiology of migration. And this is where it gets really kind of mind-bending. Some of what I'm going to talk about here, you're going to swear I'm making up, but I swear I'm not. So for example, this is a semi-palmated sandpiper. This is one of the most common, widespread shorebirds that we have in North America. They're about that long. They weigh less than an ounce. And as far as shorebirds go, they're kind of a middle-distance migrant. Compared to, for example, bar-tailed godwits, which take off from the coast of Alaska in the fall, fly 8,100 miles nonstop across the widest part of the Pacific Ocean on a journey that will take them 11 days of continuous powered flight to arrive on their wintering grounds in New Zealand. These guys are pikers because they're only going about 3,300 miles. This population that breeds in the eastern and central Canadian Arctic take off from the northeastern coast of North America, fly 3,300 miles nonstop. Again, they're that big, down to their wintering grounds on the northeastern coast of South America. That's the equivalent of a human being running 126 consecutive marathons with no food or water or rest. In fact, nothing ticks me off quite as much as people comparing birds to human athletes, because I'm sorry, the birds leave the people in the dust. I know we've got a lot of bicyclists in Aspen, so I'm going to pick on Tour de France cyclists for just a moment here. Arguably, a Tour de France cyclist is an athlete at the most elite condition. When a Tour de France cyclist is exercising, he is operating at 4 or 5 times his base metabolic rate. And he can only do that for a relatively short period of time, certainly less than a day, and only with regular food and regular hydration. That little semi-palm sandpiper's resting metabolism is higher than a human being's. Its resting body temp's about 104 degrees. And when it's flying for 4 or 5 days nonstop across the Western Atlantic, it is operating at 9 or 10 times its base metabolism. So don't talk to me about human athletes. But there is one interesting way in which these semi-palm sandpipers have something in common with at least some human athletes. So this particular population, in the fall migration, they stage up, they pause in their migration on the Bay of Fundy between New Brunswick and Nova Scotia and the coast of Maine. And of course, the Bay of Fundy, famous for its tidal range, when the tide goes out, it exposes huge mud flats. And in that mud are trillions and trillions of tiny little crustaceans called corophium. And the semi-palmated sandpipers seek out and preferentially feed on the corophium. I've never eaten corophium. Maybe they taste good. Maybe that's the reason they're seeking them out. Little dash of cocktail sauce, I don't know. But in any event, we know that the corophium are very high in omega-3 fatty acids. And those fatty acids supercharge the aerobic capacity of the bird's flight muscles. So they are basically juicing on performance-enhancing drugs, legally. So pity the poor person who, the mountaineer who's laboring up the side of, Everest or K2, some high peak in the Himalayas. They've spent weeks in base camp acclimating to the altitude. Now they're up in the death zone at 28,000 feet, sucking on supplemental oxygen, barely able to put one foot in front of the other, and they look up, and there's a flock of bar-headed geese flying overhead, a couple thousand feet above them. And these geese were not spending weeks in base camp. They took off that day from sea level and been climbing as much as 7,000 feet an hour and topping the highest mountains on the planet. And the reason they can do this is because any bird off the shelf has a vastly more efficient respiratory system than ours. We have a tidal respiration system where we breathe in, we inhale and exhale in the same pathways, and we suck at removing oxygen from the air we breathe. Whereas birds have a unidirectional respiration system, so the air takes actually 4 respirations for a single breath of air to go through the entire system of lungs and air sacs. And these bar-headed geese have even more effective hemoglobin than most birds do. So it's not that it's easy for them to go over the Himalayas, but they make it look easy compared to what people have to go through. But the strangest things that we've discovered about bird migration in the last 10 or 15 years has to do with how birds orient and how they navigate. We've known for a long time that birds have a whole host of ways that they can find their way. I said before, most birds migrate after dark. The night sky is one of the most important orientation cues the birds have. Not the pattern of the stars in the night sky, but the fact that the stars appear to rotate. And of course, what's the point that doesn't move? Polaris, the North Star. So they get their compass points that way. Of course, some nights it's cloudy, they can't see the stars, but they have a whole host of other ways they can get around it. For example, birds can use infrasound, extremely low-frequency sound wave that travels hundreds of miles generated by ocean surf or wind and high mountain passes. Seabirds can smell their way across thousands of miles of ocean back to a single breeding burrow among millions of other breeding burrows in a breeding colony. Diurnal migrants like swallows and hawks use the position and movement of the sun across the sky. But the most mysterious of all of our birds' migration cues has always been its magnetic sense. We've known from at least the middle to the end of the 19th century that birds somehow are able to sense the Earth's magnetic field. When I was in college back in the 1970s, I took a marvelous course in ornithology that got me hooked on the science of birds and not just the thrill of watching them. And we were taught birds had tiny little deposits of magnetic iron crystals called magnetite in their bill or at the base of their brain that we thought, they thought, well, it functions like a little compass, kind of pulls their nose to the north. Well, it turns out if you look more closely at those structures, they're part of the bird's immune system. They have nothing to do with navigation. And the way birds are able to use the Earth's magnetic system is so profoundly weird that even though this aspect of quantum physics grew out of his own equations, Einstein more or less disowned it. It's called quantum entanglement or radical pair theory. And I'm going to explain it to you as I understand it, but I am not a quantum physicist. But I gave this explanation once to a group, and a gentleman in the front row said, I am a quantum physicist. And I thought, oh, crap. And he said, and that, you got it pretty much exactly right. So let's say that you are a summer tanager like this one. You've taken off from the Yucatan Peninsula. After dark, you're flying across the Gulf of Mexico, heading north through the night sky. A photon of light that was emitted, 20 million years ago from some distant star, enters your eye, hits your retina, and it strikes a pigment protein called cryptochrome. The eyes of migratory birds are packed with these cryptochrome proteins. And it hits the protein, and it knocks an electron off one molecule in that protein and onto an adjacent molecule. Those molecules are now quantumly entangled. They are linked. They are in quantum terms a single thing. And quantum physicists, who say lots of things that make our brains hurt, claim that if you were able to move those two molecules anywhere in the universe, what affected one would instantaneously affect the other. Again, don't expect me to explain this, but we are told this is going to give us unhackable quantum computers and faster than light communication. But what it also does is, for the briefest fraction of a second, it magnetizes that pigment protein. And it's happening millions of times a second in the eye of the bird as it's flying through the night sky. So you have magnetically sensitive pigments in the eye of the bird that allow it to see the Earth's magnetic field. Do you know what I would give to see the Earth's magnetic field? I mean, to my mind, it must be like the aurora on steroids. It may actually be nothing more than a smudge in their vision, but they can see not just the Earth's magnetic field, but the angle at which these bands of radiation are emerging from the Earth's surface, which change in angle as you move toward or away from the poles and the equator. So it gives them their north-south axis. Now, a bird also needs to know east-west, and they can do that magnetically, but we don't know how yet. It might be the trigeminal nerve in the upper mandible of the bird's beak, but the birds still have an awful lot of secrets for us. And every time we think we understand what the limits of bird migration are, the birds blow right past them. This is an alpine swift. This is a common breeding bird in many parts of Europe. And about 10 years ago, scientists in Switzerland decided they wanted to know where alpine swifts go in the winter. They knew they went to Africa, but they weren't really sure where. So they captured a bunch of these birds. They fitted them with little backpacks with data loggers, not transmitters. It wasn't going to send any information out. It was just going to record data. There's something called a geolocator in there that would record the bird's location on its migration south to Africa and back in the spring. And they also put a little accelerometer in there that would tell them how much of the bird's day was spent flying and how much of the bird's day was spent at rest. So they send these birds off, they migrate away for the winter, they come back the next year, they recapture them, they download the data, they say, oh, look at that, the birds are going down into the bulge of tropical West Africa, and then back up across the Sahara or around Gibraltar. And then they downloaded the accelerometer data. And that's when their jaws hit the floor. Because according to the accelerometer data, these birds never stopped flying for 7 months. Continuous flight. Now, if you've watched swifts, swifts are the most aerial of all birds. They feed exclusively on flying insects. They mate on the wing. No other group of birds does that. But come on, 7 months on the wing? And yet 2 years later, when scientists in Sweden did the same experiment with common swifts, they found that they spend 10 months of the year in constant flight. If these birds can figure out how to give live birth, they're never going to land again. And for a while, we thought this was something that only Old World swifts did, but last year, scientists announced that black swifts that breed here in the Rockies do basically the same thing on the wintering grounds in Brazil, and it may be, if we look closely enough, that all swifts, all migratory swifts do this. So 10 months in the air. How do you stay awake for 10 months in the air? Well, you don't. If you're a bird, you just put half of your brain to sleep at a time. It's called unihemispheric sleep. You just turn off half of your brain for a couple of seconds and operate off the other half and then flip it back and forth. And they can just lob consciousness back and forth for a very, very, very long time. These are sooty terns. They breed on tropical islands in the Caribbean and across the tropical Pacific. And when a young sooty tern leaves its nesting island for the first time, it does not come back to land for 4.5 or 5 years until it too is old enough to start to breed. And for that 4.5 or 5 years, it wanders the world's tropical oceans, almost never landing anywhere. They're not waterproof. They can't rest on the water the way, say, an albatross does. They might drift for a little bit on some flotsam or jetsam, but for the most part, they spend 4.5 or 5 years in constant flight. Birds have so much to teach us if we leave enough of this planet undamaged and untrammeled so that we can learn their lessons. Each of these birds, each of these precious birds making these trips, and they're all precious. Every bird that makes that leap into the void is at once utterly ordinary and extraordinary, shaped by millions of generations of natural selection, crossing immensities of space through dangers that we can barely comprehend, and doing it all on the power of their own muscles and fiber and feathers. And that's always been enough. For eons, that was enough, but not anymore. For better or worse, their fate is in our hands. And so I'm doubly grateful for organizations like ACES that have been showing the rest of the world why this is important, why these birds matter, not just to us, but to everyone. Thank you very much, ACES, for having me here. Thank you all so much for coming out this evening.
Wow. Okay,
Thank you very much.
I learned more in 45 minutes than I have in the last 10 years on birding.
Thank you.
Okay, we have like 12 minutes for questions. And I'm going to be a little harsh on cutting people off, so you can't tell your life story. You got to ask a question. You were the first hand to go up in the very back. Gentlemen, I can't see who that is. We're bringing a microphone to you. Hold on. And you got to talk right into the microphone or they can't hear you.
About what altitude are these birds commonly flying?
I'm sorry, I didn't catch, even with the microphone, I didn't catch the question.
What altitude?
Oh, so it depends. If they're making relatively short flights, birds taking off tonight and it's just going to fly for a night or two, 1,500 to 2,500 feet is probably a typical altitude. If they're in long distance flights, like the birds going out over the Western Atlantic, and lots of birds take that flight out over the Western Atlantic, including blackpoll warblers that weigh half an ounce and, are operating on enough fat that I could put it on the back of my thumb, but if they were burning gasoline instead of fat, they'd get 720,000 miles to the gallon. Those birds are often flying at 8, 9, 10, 11,000 feet, and possibly even higher than that. But not at an altitude that you have to worry about them getting like sucked into the engine on your 737-300 the next time you're flying across the country.
Next question right here. Yes.
Yeah. Which organizations do you feel do the most effective job at conserving bird populations, both nationally and internationally?
Well, there's a bunch of them, and of course at different scales. If you're talking about at the national scale, the National Audubon Society does a really great job. The American Bird Conservancy does a really great job. ABC has two specialties that ABC, well, actually three specialties ABC has is window collisions, pesticide issues in birds, and they have a terrific cats indoor campaign to try to convince people. We lose 2 to 4 billion birds, billion with a B, birds in the United States every year to free-running cats, whether we're talking about feral cats or house cats that are allowed outside. It is the single biggest human-related cause of bird death that we have out there. People worry about windows, people get worked up about wind turbines. Just keep your cat inside. That ought to be the easiest thing to do. Sorry, went off on a rant there. But I would also urge you to get involved at the local level with organizations like ACES, and I'm not just saying that because I'm here with ACES, and also get involved at the local level politically. One of the most effective things you can do as a conservationist is get involved in a local planning or zoning commission, which tend to be dominated by people with a financial interest in development, not surprisingly, and there's nothing evil about that. But conservation doesn't usually get much of a hearing at that level. Internationally, BirdLife International, which is based in the Netherlands, is an incredibly effective organization. They have partner organizations around the world. In the United States, it's Audubon, it's Birds Canada in Canada. There's a lot of them out there, and I can't think of any that are doing bad work. I mean, everybody's doing the work of the angels.
Next question. Isa, I'm going for right here.
All right, well, thank you.
Yep.
So about a week ago, there was an incredible article in the Times about our groundwater use shifting the Earth's axis.
Yeah.
How is that going to affect bird migration?
Oh, the answer to that is I don't know. I was staggered by that story, that we've sucked so much water out of the Earth that we've changed the 23.5 degree tilt that the Earth is off. I mean, that's why we have seasons. I suspect that birds have enough slop built into the system that they can cope with that. They're not that finely calibrated. The other thing that I get questioned about a lot is, the polarity Earth's polarity flops about every 100,000 years or so. North Pole becomes South Pole becomes North Pole. It looks like that may be happening again relatively soon. There's some, the poles seem to be getting kind of loose and wobbly. Shouldn't affect the birds in the slightest because they're not, as I said with that magnetic sensitivity, they're not using the polarity. It's not like a compass going to the North Pole. They just know if they're going away from the equator and toward the pole or away from the pole and toward the equator. So even when it flops, they've been doing this for a long time. You know, birds have been around for, you know, more than 100 million years in some forms. They've been migratory for probably much of that time, and they've figured it out. Climate change, that's a whole different ball of wax. We can get into that, but I'm not too concerned about them losing their way because we've shifted the Earth's axis. So that's one thing you can stop worrying about.
Next question, Nete, right there.
I can just yell. Okay. What I'm wondering about that ball of wax, about climate change. Could you talk a little bit about climate change and how it's impacting birds?
So climate change is already impacting every single moment of every migratory bird's life. I mean, that's the short answer. The question is, are birds going to be able to adapt quickly enough? I mean, they've gone through tremendous climatic swings in the past, but they've always had lots and lots of time to get used to new climate regimes. The scariest thing about climate change to me is the rapidity with which it's happening. You know, I have an acquaintance who is a polar ice scientist, and when Claire was working on her graduate work in the late 1980s, she was told she was wasting her time because polar ice was a dead-end field. And look at how fast that has changed. But I also don't underestimate the resiliency of birds. We don't give them enough credit. And I don't want to say that to be complacent, and I don't want to say that to be Pollyanna-ish, but they're incredible organisms, and all they need is a little bit of a chance. If, you know, we've actually made surprising progress on slowing the advance of climate change. I mean, there's a lot baked in. This is going to be a bad year with El Nino coming in. You know, we just had the hottest day in the last 125,000 years, and we're probably going to have another one today. But if we can slow it even further, if we can give these birds a chance, for example, and I'll try to keep this short, it's pied flycatchers, which are a migratory bird in Europe. They migrate from Western and Central Europe to tropical Africa. Migratory birds migrate based on, to a large extent, what's baked into their DNA, the timing of their migration, the direction and route of their migration. They don't learn to migrate. They're not following anybody else. And these pied flycatchers have been coming back on the same schedule since time immemorial, and they fell so far out of sync with the rapidly advancing spring season that by the time their chicks were at their hungriest in the nest, the caterpillars on which they depended, the peak was gone and they didn't survive. And pied flycatcher populations dropped by as much as 90% in many parts of Europe in the late 90s and early 2000s. But then, and this does not mean climate change stopped, but the rapid warming that was occurring in Europe during that critical period in late April and early May slowed. And the birds caught up. They actually evolved a more rapid return, and their populations rebuilt. They're doing fine today. They just need a little bit of a chance. And so I think our job as conservationists is to do everything we can to give them that chance. So.
We have time. We have time. Can you hear me? We have time for one more question. But before the last question, you know, Scott may be one of the best birders around, but we also, for everyone who cares about birds in this room, have the best birder around here tonight, Rebecca Weiss. Woo! And if you wanna go birding with Rebecca, you can do that through ACES, and she's absolutely outstanding. I'll say that for a fact. And the last question is, and then I'm gonna go to the very back. Sorry, right? Yes, you in the back.
We can't, yeah, hold on.
Wait on the mic.
Yeah, can you hear me? Can you comment on whether young birders are an endangered species and what we need to do to get them interested?
Oh, no. Young birders are, there's a ton more young birders today than there were when I was growing up. And I just came, 2 weeks ago, I was at Audubon's Hog Island camp on the coast of Maine, where every year for now 23 years, we've been running a teen ornithology field camp that overlaps with our adult field ornithology camp. 20 amazing 14 to 17-year-old birders. And what I love about them is they're not just birders. They're interested in birds and the environment that they fit into. I come away completely energized. I mean, some of these kids are growing up somewhat isolated, but most of them have other kids they know in their schools who are birders. God, I would have killed for somebody else who was interested in any of this stuff. I would have been happy if I wasn't getting pantsed and stuffed in a locker because I was interested in birds, quite frankly. On the other hand, I messed around a lot with venomous snakes in those days, so don't mess around with naturalists. But that's a story for after the statute of limitations has expired. No, I think there's you've got young birders clubs in almost every state, in many different parts of states, in a lot of different cities. There's a ton of young birders coming up, and they're super, and they're charged, and they're energized, and I think they're going to save the world. So on that,
Thank you, Scott.
Thank you all very much.
Thank you all for coming. Thank you, Scott.
Very much. Really appreciate it. Thanks.
Thank you, everybody, for coming out. We appreciate it. Good night.